Hi, Helen. It's wonderful to actually see real people. I know that sounds like a strange thing, but it is lovely to see real faces. So if you feel, thanks, Debbie, if you feel you can do that, and Dave and Andrea and Alex, that's really, really good. Thanks, Lucy and Alan. Fantastic. Thanks for that. So remote working has been so pervasive for all of us for certainly the last year, some for even more than a year. We kind of forgotten what it's like to be in a shared workspace. And for some people, that's brilliant. Talking to somebody yesterday who commutes 4 hours there and back to work, and it's been an absolute godsend. For some, it's a real drain. So it's difficult to say whether it works absolutely one way or the other. Some people, it's a bit of both. So we're thinking about how do our value systems and thinking a little wider perhaps than we've thought before, or we may have been on similar webinars, so just trying to set a slightly bigger perspective to see this in. It'd be fascinating to get some feedback from you. And as Alan said, please feel free to heckle at any point. Nothing he likes more than a heckler. So Alan, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you all for making the time. Delighted to be with you live, and for those that may watch this on catch up, use the phrase. I'm going to share screen, sort of time-honoured fashion. I'm going to canter through a fair old space because it's recorded. You can watch it later, and just share some thoughts about as we return to work. What are some of the things we really need to be thinking about? But recognise around the world that there are different nation states in different points of the sort of COVID cycle and the return to work and so on. And as Katie was saying, managing the workforce in their return to work is not a one-size-fits-all, which is really what we want to get to in this conversation. But there are sort of, the way I think about it is there's sort of macro things to consider, meta things and micro things. So as people re-engage, going back in the office, there are some issues that have been quiet, which will resurface. So as people start and the world starts to normalize a bit, and actually we're already seeing this, is the whole issue of global warming comes back on the agenda. And so those of you who've been watching the news, you know, will have seen this already. The BBC's done a year in the life of Greta Thunberg. There was an item on the news this morning saying that given climate change and the water shortage that's created in Taiwan, it's really impacted the 10 billion semiconductor business. So this will start to surface again, whereas we've all been completely consumed with COVID. As we start to return to work and things start to normalise, that will come front and centre. So in the UK, again on the news.
Sorry, Alan, can I just interrupt 1 second? Can everybody just go, just mute their microphones? There's just a little bit of noise coming out, unless you're going to speak. If you can mute your mics, that's fab. Sorry, Alan.
When you've got a heckle to go. Well, I was just saying there was an item on the news this morning, you know, Boris Johnson promising to cut UK admissions by 78% by 2035. So, you know, partly because there's a sort of climate change conference coming up where Biden's rejoined the Paris summit and all of it. So these things that have been off the agenda for 18 months are going to come back on the agenda. That's a big global macro level. So there's some macro issues. In most corporations, probably one of the most pressing issues and themes at the time today is the diversity and inclusion, or I think about it really not as D&I, but inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and ultimately system justice, which is sort of ideas, if you like. It's a sort of acronym. Some companies have gone from D&I to D, E and I, because they don't want to go D-I-N-E, because obviously that's not good. So that comes back on the agenda again. And also, and I'm going to just touch on this in a moment, the evolution of people trends. So as we think, and we've kind of really brought into sharp focus that people are our most important asset, and that's become profoundly obvious through COVID. We live in these macro trends of how we even think about the people issues is changing and has been changing. So there's some big macro global issues that start to flush through again as everybody returns to work. Then there's some slightly more kind of meta issues in how is the workplace going to change. So, you know, we're going into remote working. We're going into what we call a sort of a hybrid flipped work experience, you know, where work becomes, you know, a play space and home becomes where we do the deep stuff because we can get concentration and quiet. So it's sort of flipped around. So we're going to do a home work hybrid, but it's flipped. Home becomes work and work becomes home kind of thing. So that's kind of interesting. New ways of connecting tech and the innovation of tech, change capability, particularly on culture and social capital, mature leaders, energy management, emotional well-being. I'm going to just dig into some of that and ultimately how we all individually experience that and which bits of this agenda, macro and meta, and how we respond to that agenda will depend entirely on our own, you know, what matters to us and what's important to us. So at the global level, you know, if you believe Greta, and you've seen the BBC documentary, A Year to Change the World, which sort of chronicled her through the back end of 2019 through 2020, the research suggests there's going to be a global crop failure in 2038. So that's 18 years and the clock's ticking. Greta now thinks it's 8 years. So because of decompensation mathematics, it's difficult to put a date on when a really severe crisis is going to hit. But as we return to work, this is going to come up front and center. So we're all going to have to start leaning. Katie and I were talking to a global fast fashion producer, and the data suggests that fast fashion is one of the industries that's probably adding disproportionately to climate change. Not least if you fly fashion around the world, because you could ship it and shipping it reduces the carbon footprint of fast fashion dramatically. So if governments start to introduce regulation around fast fashion, you know, that company is going to have to address that. So this starts to come back on the agenda, some of these climate change type implications. And then how we see the people agenda has changed right since the people agenda started. So back in 1900, when HR as a function started, it was all welfare officers and paternalism. And then it was labor relations and robber barons and, you know, power plays between bosses and unions and all that. And then through post-World War II, there's a bit of a gap here as we went through World War II and we sort of experienced, the world experienced red despots running large, particularly in Europe, but elsewhere, is we started to put rules and regulations in place, UN and so on, to try and restrict red despots. And the people practices started to move towards process and principle approach. We've got to have some principles in the workforce of how we're going to do HR. It wasn't even called HR back then. And eventually, most companies, the vast bulk of people practices in most modern companies has reached this fourth wave, where we talk about HR managers and HRDs at the top. Much more pragmatic, you know, data analytics sort of version of HR. But even how we think about people practices has been evolving over the last 100 years. And this is what I wrote about in this book here about the past, present, future of HR and people practices in business. So as we return to work, you know, depending on whether your company is still frankly stuck in the 60s and 70s in its people practice, or whether it's a bit more pragmatic, or it might be slightly ahead of the wave, you know, so those companies that have moved from the sort of HRD to the CHRO, which is really a stepping stone between the orange and the green wave. If your HR director has been relabeled the CPO, you might be a bit more in the green wave, where we're starting to realize, you know, these are not human resources, they're people. You know, so let's treat them like people. Let's treat them like human beings, as opposed to, you know, assets to be leveraged, you know, pawns on a chessboard. So a much more people-centric set of practices. So that's been, and in most companies is still the leading edge of people practices. So depending on which organization you're living in, your organization might still be largely the bulk of its approach to people practices might be the 60s or 70s, or it might be pretty modern, or it might be at the leading edge. Only 20% of the planet have really made it to this edge here. One or two companies, and we wrote about this in this book here, saying there's some things yet to come, because the book takes us up to 2050 in terms of the way that organizations see the people agenda. Some of the things that we wrote about, we said this won't occur till 2030, are happening now. So COVID has truncated the time, and it's changed the way that we see. So where CPOs eventually end up, paradoxically, CAO, Chief Admin Officer, which is sort of paradoxical because it's people, and admin sounds like a process. So there's all sorts of paradoxes coming in. It's more like a chief of staff. So it becomes much more integrated into the business, and the administration, human being and process, becomes gelled a bit. So there's all sorts of stuff in the paradox wave, and ultimately it becomes Chief Development Officer. So it literally becomes about the phenomena of development in its broadest sense. So every organization is living with this macro global trend. The way that we think about the people issues and what needs to happen for the people issues is itself changing globally. And there's, in every geography, there's one or two companies at this top end. Most are around the sort of orange, the sort of leading edge is around the green, and some of those who are behind the curve are in the blues. As you go back to work, what will happen will depend a lot on the people function and where it is. I mean, is it modern? Is it slightly behind the wave? Is it slightly ahead of the wave? So what happens on the return to work is dictated by that as much as anything else. How those leaders think about the people practices. So that's at the macro level, just to call out a few of the things that are going on at the macro level. And this is our new office for many of us. I mean, I know, Gavin looks like he just got off there, based on his background about 10 minutes ago, off that beach just next to the Golden Gate Bridge. Mary's wishing she was there, I can see. And Clancy was there last week, judging by her colour. So, but this is the office of the world that we now live in, right? That is the upside of the remote office. So we've seen many companies completely change the way that they see it. So there's many advantages to that, but there are disadvantages to it too. But remote working is going to be with us for a very long time, and it completely changes the way we see employment, because we had one company that's decided to completely outsource the whole of its finance function to Lithuania because it's cheaper. And so, sorry, finance function, you're all redundant. The whole office has moved to Lithuania, unless you want to go to Lithuania, in which case you've still got a job. So it's really, really disruptive, this remote working, because we're genuinely in a world now, and I mean that, use that word deliberately, we're in a world. And it doesn't matter where you are, you can telecommute in. So we've talked about that for a long time. We're now in that. And this flip in the work experience. So when we go back, are we going back, in socially distanced big space, or are we going back for a party? How are we seeing this? Is the workspace now a play space, or is it just a big space? So a lot of companies are thinking very clearly about, should they shrink their footprint? So if 50% of their workforce never want to go back, or only go back 50% of the time, they don't need as much space. Or are they going to use it for space and maintain social distances? So these are some of the things, but I think the general thing is this hybrid flip. People will do some work at home, some work at work, but the way that we think about home and the way that we think about work is going to be flipped. So it's going to change dramatically, and all companies considering what footprint do they really need. So that's the flipping of the work experience at the meta level, and so many of you have experienced this type of experience. Fortunately, my 4 boys are slightly beyond this age, but I can certainly recognize that. You're trying to get stuff done. So, can you really multitask? And it will be helped by tech. So even if you're at home, and we'll get onto that, tech is going to help you do this hybrid flip. new ways of connecting with each other. So actually, a lot of companies have built their own apps, and this gives us a technology for, in a virtual world, for connecting in a completely different way. So we'll be able to live stream how people are feeling and track. So in the HR and the people practices, data analytics is going to transform in the next 3 or 4 years. And we can engage with apps like this that can give you a heat map of, you know, is the Frankfurt office really, really irritated and the Guildford office delighted, or vice versa. We can live track these things, live track engagement, live track inclusion, and look at the way that people are connected. So forget the org chart. The org chart's 1910 technology. It doesn't describe how companies work. In the future, we're working through these networks. This is live data. This is a live org chart of what companies really look like now. It's just that most companies haven't got this data, so they don't realize this is what you're really managing. You're not managing a series of boxes with lines. That's nonsense. That bears no relationship to what's really going on. So you need to get the data on the network and see how it's really working, and see how you manage these fluid networks. And so that's a really important thing, understanding the way that people connect, because as they go back to work, we need to be super mindful. Who do we connect with to get the job done? Operational connectivity. Who do we connect with for cultural reasons? You know, for that sense of community, that sense of belonging, that being part of, that relationship building. And who do we connect with for strategic reasons? So we have 3 essential networks: operational networks, cultural networks, and strategic networks. And we need to see the data. And we need to understand, who should we be connecting with? I mean, who are the cultural influencers? They're probably different from the strategic influencers, who are different from the people, the operational influencers. So all of that's described in networks. So we start to realize that the way that we're connecting to each other in this hybrid flipped world, unbelievably critical. So we need to be thoughtful about that. Who do we connect to and why? And, you know, we need to get some data on all of that. So new ways of connecting, we need to lean into that as we all go back. And tech, you know, people love tech, you know, and tech is going to continue to change the entire work experience. So this is even in when we go back to work, we may not need to get on a plane for those critical meetings. We can get augmented reality. So with the right tech, you can appear virtually in that office. You don't need the plane, right? So that's going to start coming in. Now that's, you know, only a few probably Silicon Valley companies doing anything like that, but it will start as the price of the tech becomes easier and people get used to it. That will start to happen. So augmented reality will start to kick in. We'll start to get these shared platforms where we're all working on a shared platform. Zoom will be a perennial, or video conferencing like this. That's here to stay. But we're working on shared platforms and shared documents and shared task managements. And this is already happening in many global companies, Scrum Masters and swarms. As the silos break down, because, you know, they don't give you the flexibility you need in a complex world, geographies and national boundaries become less important. So what becomes important is shared platforms, shared interactivity, abilities to collaborate, and all the rules that you need around to make sure that happens in a safe and secure way. As we talked about the global workforce now, and ultimately AI and machine learning. So the first wave of AI and machine learning is all about how do you speed up linear tasks, but ultimately it gets to non-linear tasks. And the future of AI is much more interesting than we're led to believe, because most people are still concerned with how we get roboticization and autonomous vehicles and all of that, rapid search, you know, so we're going to remove doctors and lawyers and accountants largely, because an awful lot of that is linear task and flow decision tree. So all of that will go. So, but what remains is a super complex, nuanced integration, because it would take a long time for AI to be able to code human consciousness. It will happen, but it's a much longer journey away. So it's going to be disruptive, but ultimately what's exciting is the interface between AI and machine learning and human development. and how human development stimulates AI and how AI stimulates human development. So there's another whole agenda there that has yet to erupt. So in the short term, it'll be some of this type of stuff, but in the medium to long term, it's going to be completely different than what's even being talked about right now. And culture, the way that we feel and the kind of interactivity and the ability to change, I honestly believe one of the primary competitive advantages moving forward is the ability to change, because as the world is changing faster and faster, as human beings, we need to understand the 12 steps which are here, and this is this next book coming up later on in the year, the 12 steps of change and the 4 phases of change. How does the culture, and this is cultural evolution here, how does the culture change? So how do we as leaders become change agents? So as people come back, we need to really start leading into the whole nature of change. And human beings have got a very ambivalent relationship. In fact, most of our metaphors around change allude to that ambivalence. Don't rock the boat, you know, steady as she goes, and all of that, right? Whereas we've got to embrace change. You know, we've got to love change. You know, I mean, it's paradoxically ironic that change is the only constant. There's a paradox and an irony right there. But we've got to get good at it, and most people don't like it. They want to, you know, keep things the same. And in business, you know, no surprises, said most leaders. You know, but actually, you know, who could have predicted COVID, and who could have predicted the consequences of COVID? And even when it started to hit in January, February last year, we were all going, oh, well, 3 months, we'll be through it. And here we are, you know, more than a year later, and yet to emerge, right? So what does that really teach us as humanity is, you know, things are changing at such a pace. The only thing and the only sensible response is to become very, very comfortable with change, and not only understand change as a phenomena and study it and study how to get good at it, but become a change champion. So you can guide and direct that change rather than being swept along, which is understand the 4 phases and 12 steps of any change, whether that's a change to you as a leader and a human being, a change to your team, or a change to the organization. So all of that needs to be embraced as we return to work. You know, we need to grow up and operate in these deliberately developmental organizations and start to become much more innovative. If you look at the data, certainly in the UK currently wastes 65 billion a year in failed product launch and service launches. So we're doing it really badly. So leaders need to become much more personable, human, authentic, all of that stuff. But to be authentic, you have to grow up, because what are you being authentic to? You know, people talk about leadership authenticity a lot, but you're authentic to what exactly? Who are you? Most leaders don't know who they are. Why not? They've been so busy with task and target and goal and metric. They haven't spent much time studying what's going on inside here. So it's sort of ironic that it's much talked about leadership authenticity, but what's not talked about is the key piece of that, which is how have you changed? I mean, you're not the same person you were at 18, I hope. Right? Goodness me, if you're the same person you were at 18, there's something profoundly wrong. And as I often joke, the proudest day of my life is when my wife told me, you're not the man I married. Fantastic, because when I married you, I was an idiot. Hopefully I've grown up a bit since then. You know, but many leaders wear no change as a badge of honor. I've always been this way. I've always led this way. I mean, that's disastrous, right? So we change as human beings. Hopefully the best of us grow up and become the best version of ourselves. And it's amazing how many leaders don't embrace that. So I've often said, if you look back at the person you were just 6 months ago and you're not slightly embarrassed by that person you were 6 months ago, you're not changing, right? You need to embrace this and start to develop, you know, the team, the organization, and that's what being a DDO, this is an American term, deliberately developmental organization, where you use development as a strategic advantage. So if you've got the most developed leaders, you've got the most developed teams, and you've got the most developed processes and practices, you'll outperform the competition. That's what, so you've got personable leaders and outcome-focused managers if we're in a VR world. So all of that's kicking on. And of course, the other thing I just want to mention is the importance of mental health. Mental health is going to grow up, hopefully, in the next 3 or 4 years. It's not mental and it's not health. What it really is emotional well-being. So the only way we're going to deal with the exhaustion and the Zoom fatigue is starting to focus on the thing that really matters is not cognition, mental, it's not mental, it's energy and emotion. That's the thing we've got to focus on. And so as we come back to the office, we've got to embrace the real agenda and start to move the dial on those things. And then all of that, if you take all of that, those macro and those meta issues, how we deal with all of that depends on what is important to us, what we're motivated by. And so just to remind you, there are only 8 motivational or what's called value systems in the world. There are only 8, and everybody in the world operates largely from one of these value systems. So if you're going to try and manage a workforce, you know, and give them guidance and support and encouragement, that guidance and support and encouragement needs to vary profoundly depending on what matters to them. Not what matters to you, what matters to them. So just very briefly, every level has an upside and a downside. So beige is where we all start, when we're just, you know, Maslow's hierarchy, food, water, shelter, and it's about our individual survival. The downside is we're not making much progress. So eventually we gang together, the collective kicks in, and we've got safety in numbers. So we swing from individual, collective, all the way up this evolutionary spiral. The downside of that is there's no real direction because we've got mob rule. It's always the downside that provokes evolution. So eventually a red leader emerges, grabs the reins, starts giving direction and makes something happen. So you'll see that in startup, you'll see it in turnaround, you'll see it in opening up new sales opportunities. One of the commonest 2 types of leaders we see in organization is a red leader. But the downside of that is they're often egomaniacs. So then the collective starts to gang together to curb the excesses of the egomaniac, put some process and rules in place which induce stability and order. But the downside of that is we get rigid and inflexible bureaucracies and in extreme version fundamentalism. So that becomes pathological. So we've got to start to break out of that rigidity, which we did in the UK largely in the 70s, not by design, inadvertently, because that was the cultural norm. And we had a loads of money boom, certainly in the, you know, after 1979, in the 80s and the 90s, the Thatcher Reagan era. But of course, we saw the downside of that, greed and manipulation. And we saw that peak in the 2008 economic collapse as a load of 50 men, and I've got 34 names, so I'm gradually hunting down who did that. Only one woman, this is a little matter of interest, only one woman, but 34 men I've tracked down who did the global financial crisis. Why? Because those men could game the financial system because we removed the blue rules and enabled them to game the system and put £200 million in their own pocket. No concern that it was going to create a global crisis, create 30 million unemployed inside 12 months, and hundreds of thousands of suicides globally as people's lives imploded. But those 200 blokes didn't care. They got 200 million themselves. That's greed and manipulation, right? And so the world wakes up to that and says there's got to be a better way. We've got to take better care of ourselves and each other. And by the way, the planet. So here's the Greta Thunberg agenda. We've got to have more people in caring. But on the downside, that stagnates because we get stuck in consensual hell and we start to get mean green and the wheels come off. So over political correctness and so on. So we eventually get yellow, which is disruptive and innovative, but it could be too complicated. And eventually we get turquoise. Only 2% of the planet has reached yellow and turquoise. So 80% of the planet is orange or below, 20% are green, less than 2% in these top 2 levels. So there's the value systems. And my final slide, if you want to look at these macro and meta issues, so I've just taken the meta issues, every single value system wants something different in relation to those issues. So if you take remote working, some people hate it, some people are happy with it. So if you have a one-size-fits-all approach, you'll irritate some people and delight others. And so you'll wonder why it's a struggle in remote working for some people. Well, it depends what matters to them, whether remote working works for them or doesn't work for them. So don't take a unitary approach to all of that. right? If you're looking at this flipped hybrid working, where we've got a bit of work at home, a bit of work in the office, but it's flipped because the office is the play space, the work is the home is the deep workplace. Some people have got no problem with that. They're going to adapt to any way of working. Other people are extremely challenged by that. Some people are quite happy with it. Other people are ambivalent about it. So if you have a one-size-fits-all approach to this sort of flipped working or tech, you know, some people are delighted. They're a big advocate of big tech. Other people are very worried or concerned. So you can't afford to take a one-size-fits-all. And what it really means is you have to understand the value systems of the workforce, and you have to have a plan for them. So depending on whether your workforce is predominantly orange or predominantly blue or predominantly green, and actually most companies are a bit of all of these things. So you might need a different plan for the finance division, who might be a bit more blue, than the sales division, who might be a bit more red. So how you manage the return to work for the sales force might need to be quite different than how you manage it for the finance function. So my main message to you is it has to flex according to the value system, which is why you need to understand not just your own value systems and what you're likely to broadcast in, but most importantly, the value system of the people you're supporting. So you've got to message and understand their value system as they return to work so you can support them properly. So that was my main point, is to give you a kind of canter through some of these macro and meta changes and how you're going to experience that at the individual human being, you and those around you at the micro level, through what matters to you and your own value systems. So that's probably enough from me, and I'm glad nobody heckled in a way, because I could canter through much faster. But now's your chance. Go for it. Knock yourself out.
So, some questions, some thoughts, some obviously some different perspectives there, as always. What does that leave you thinking? What are you mulling over at the moment? Even if it isn't a question, maybe just an observation. Just an observation. If we can, it'd be great to see a few more of you as well.
Delighted if you profoundly disagree with all of that, you know, or if you agree with it, or you agree with bits of it, or, you know, it provoked a thought in you. So now's your chance to embarrass yourself and ask a question or share something.
Claire, do you want to ask something?
Well, I was just going to say, I think I agree with your observation, Alan, that a one-size-fits-all answer to kind of the future of work or the now of work is kind of a road to disaster. I think what I'm struggling with is how you find a multi-answer approach to the question.
Well, I think my guidance would be, if you can listen to the words that people use and the way that they frame things. So even if you haven't formally assessed, and Katie runs the part of our business where you can measure these things, and you can say, these are your value systems when you're strategizing and executing and managing people, we can measure it for you. But even if you don't do that, if you listen to the way that people articulate, the very words they choose, the metaphors they choose. So for example, you know, people that come from the red value system, you know, COVID's been a war on COVID, it's been a battle, you know, so they use battle metaphors. You know, people from the orange value system tends to use mechanical machinery metaphors. You know, people from the blue value system. So in trying to figure out how do you customize or personalize the approach for different groups of people, if you listen to them talking about the challenge, it should help guide you as to how to support them. So you might have to play, you know, what are the rules of virtual working if it's a blue value system that you're talking to? You know, how do I make this work in practice? So just forget all the rules. The orange people want some pragmatic guidance. Yeah. So it's a matter of tuning into them, Claire, and then adapting what you're doing to meet their needs rather than a one size fit, you know, here's the company approach. One size fits all.
Yeah, okay.
Gavin.
Yeah, hi Alan. I'd like to add one more layer of complication Yeah, because the way we're talking about it, as if we're talking about the population of employees at various levels. But one thing that comes to my mind is we're going to be talking to leaders who are going to be going through their own journey as well. So how to balance, so do they sort themselves out and not worry about anybody else until they've sorted themselves out? Do they put themselves to one side and worry more about the people to get the leverage effect, or are they trying to do both at the same time?
That's a great question. So, you know, if you're a leader, you're quite familiar with the both and answer to most questions, right? So it's not that simple, right? As you move up and you get responsibility, one of the things that moves up is the complexity of what you're dealing with. So if you're an individual contributor, you know, at the client interface or on the shop floor or whatever, the world is still relatively straightforward. But with every new level that you might move up the organization, the world gets more and more complicated. The challenge gets more and more difficult. That's one of the justifications of why you get the bigger bucks, right? Because you're dealing with more complexity. But here's the thing, is you've got to embrace that level of complexity. So do I look after myself? Do I look after the people? Do I look after the strategy? The answer to that is yes. You look after all of that. And you've got to handle that level of complexity. Now, how do you handle that level of complexity if you yourself are not thinking about the evolution of your own change? Which is why it takes you back to this stage. So what happens in most people, which is why this book's coming out, is that as the world gets more complicated, here at step one, I haven't even noticed the world's got more complicated. At step two, my reality's been challenged because the wheels have come up. Some disasters beset the company or me personally. You know, the kids have told me they hate me, whatever it is. I've got some challenge to my reality, and my natural response is to refuse that, resist that, say that's not so, rationalize and justify, and try and go back to my comfort zone. But there's no going back, right? All of that resistance won't solve the problem. You might distract yourself with workaholism or shopaholism or any kind of aholism, some addiction to something, but none of that solves the problem. So eventually it will occur to you that the resistance has to subside because you're not solving the problem. You're just stuck in resistance. Once the resistance subsides, you'll get to a point of decision where you have to decide on some of the questions that you're talking about, Gavin. Am I just going to look after number one? Am I going to look after the team? Am I going to look after the family? Am I going to do, you know, you're going to have to make some decisions. Who am I in the face of all of this? Am I going to lead? Am I going to become a better version of myself? Or am I going to try and muddle through without any commitment to my own evolution? So you reach a decision point. So we're going to have to face into those decisions because the world is going to get more and more complicated and it's going to get faster and faster. So if you reach that point of commitment, you're going to have to cross the threshold because unless you commit to changing yourself and getting more complex / sophisticated / nuanced to match the complexity of the world, you've got no chance. And even once you make that commitment, there's still the work to be done. You've got to prepare for the journey ahead. You know, you've got to do the work, and then you've got to do the deep work, and then you've got to embody all that before you can return and deliver with this much greater expanded version of you. So that's why, you know, we're writing about this, is because it's going to become the most critical thing. How much can you change you as the world is changing and changing and changing? That will be the primary competitive advantage. So those leaders that can develop and that are prepared to look at themselves, including the aspects of themselves they don't want to look at, their shadow, those are the ones that are going to flourish. Those are the ones that will really be the leaders of the future. You know, one has to have the humility in the face of this unbelievable pace of change to say, I don't know. But what I will find out is how to know and how to change. And I'll study that as a phenomenon. So that's what this is about. So I think it is that complicated, and it ain't going to get any easier anytime soon. In fact, in this exponential world, it's going to get faster and more complex. So we need to buckle up and start leaning into it. Alex?
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, Alex.
Sorry, Alan. What I wanted to ask was, does this methodology of development extend beyond the business world and teams there to the wider social, political, governmental sort of development?
It's a great question. And my view is it has to. And we in the business here have an education division. We're doing work in schools because, quite frankly, some of the things we're teaching, 50 to 6-year-olds, 50 to 60-year-old, and some younger ones, chief executives, it's slightly embarrassing because they should have learned some of this when they were 8, right? But it's just not taught in schools. It's not taught in schools. So I don't blame that to point the finger at anybody, right? If nobody ever taught you this, if nobody taught you some of these things, how would you know it? We don't know what we don't know. So we're going back into schools and saying, look, some of the things we're teaching these 50-year-olds, you should have learned when you're 8. So we're going to start teaching the 8-year-olds, and hopefully we'll have a cohort coming through. So we also work, as you know, with Olympic athletes and so basically all walks of life. But the difference in corporations is I honestly believe the only people that can save humanity now are corporations, organizations, largely the change agents of society and the future of humanity is organizations. There's been a regression politically across the planet. So political leadership has regressed in the last 5 to 10 years. Religious leadership, we can argue about whether that's been a busted flush for some time. Our main hope, the future of humanity now, I honestly believe, rests in the hands of corporate leaders. So we've got to step up to the plate. We've got to wake up, grow up, and show up differently. And that's what this is about. So we've got to understand the challenge, else if we don't really understand, we can't make the kind of decisions that Gavin's talking about. You can't make a decision beyond your level of comprehension. That's a little quote from the Matrix film too, by the way. That's what the Oracle said to Neo. You cannot, it's in the book. You can't make a decision beyond your own comprehension. So you've got to, knowledge up. You've got to, move up, develop vertically, as we call it, to get ahead. So it will be in all walks of life, and we work, with sports people in education, but our predominant focus is in the corporate world, because that's the people who are going to save humanity. I honestly think that's where the game is.
Catherine.
Yeah, Alan, really interesting as always. I sit here sort of, in awe of how it all fits together. One of the things I'm musing on though is what role coming together in our workspaces in the future, what role does that play in development versus the sort of
great question
separated situation we're in now with everybody working remotely?
So as you know, all of us live in 3 dimensions. The problem is many corporate leaders have become one-dimensional, because the task and the targets and the pressure to deliver a number, we're so it addicted. And by it, I mean, what is it that we're doing? We've become human doings on a hamster wheel of goals and targets and metrics and, all of that. I was watching the documentary series called Dirty Money last night, and the first episode is unbelievable about Wells Fargo. If you haven't seen it, it's quite the lesson about how they created a culture where the targets were so oppressive, people started to do all sorts of dodgy practices to meet the number. And that's what you see in business, is we kind of lose our way because we get addicted to a number and we lose connection with our own humanity, our I. And the relationship that you talk about is people start to, do unpleasant things to each other in pursuit of this number. So actually human beings exist in 3 dimensions. We have an interior. So as I'm talking to you right now, you're all having thoughts and feelings about what I'm saying. That's your I. And we're chatting with each other. That's the relationship that builds even over Zoom. That's the we, that's the interpersonal domain. And we're doing something, a meeting. So in this moment right now, there are 3 dimensions to you. There's your interior, your I, there's your relation, your we, and what are you doing? You're in a meeting. That's your it. I, we, it. Now, we've been excessively focused on it, task, target, goal, metric, outcome, observable phenomena out there in the world. And we've got to break that it addiction. And what I was just saying there about the change curve, get good at developing ourselves. That's the development of I, because that's what leadership is about. It's the evolution of the I. But to get to the higher ends of I, you need we. Because I might sit in a cave and meditate on my navel for 5 years and come to the conclusion that I'm a genius. And then I encounter people in the world and I realize I'm an idiot because they're all twice the genius of what I got to, right? And I don't discover that. So we don't really get advanced development in isolation, right? So I often say to, co-op to Star Trek phase is the we space is the final frontier. That's where our real development works. And any husband worth his weight will tell you it's a good job he was married because he was a bit of an idiot till he got married, until his wife taught him a trick or two and taught him a thing or two about relationship, right? So we develop most in relationship with each other. Male, female doesn't really matter, right? So, and in fact, I'd suggest to you all that actually this is who we are. We are social animals, and it's right at the core of the reason we're the most successful species on the planet. The two most successful species on the planet are human beings and bacteria. And they're successful for the same reason, collaboration. And in fact, if you really want to push the envelope on this, human beings are bacteria, right? If you look at the number of cells in the human body, 90% of them are bacterial cells on our skin and in our gut. Only 10% of all the cells in the human body are actually human cells, 90% of them bacterial cells. If you look at DNA, the volume of DNA, we're 99% bacterial and viral DNA, and only 1% human DNA. So actually human beings are basically a bacteria in a human coat. But we're all successful. Bacteria and human beings are successful for the same reason. We're collaborative, right? And so the salvation for us lies in understanding who we really are. We are social animals that succeed better when we grow the pie, when we look after each other, when we take care of each other better together. And we haven't yet grown up enough as human beings to realize that. We're still fighting each other. For goodness sake, 50% of people get divorced. So the primary relationship, the person you choose as your number one in your life, half of the people can't even make that work. So relationships are incredibly difficult, right? Because we're complicated things. So there's a lot of work for us to do, Catherine, you and I have talked about this many times, a lot of work for us to do to get better. We've got to grow up and stop trying to force ourselves on the world and work with each other and understand each other, which is why diversity and inclusion is really, really important. We've got to change our orientation towards difference, right? We're so fearful and insecure is that we're trying to assert ourselves, and we struggle if somebody's different from us or has got a different point of view. But that's where the magic is, right? It's beautiful that you disagree with me because that makes it interesting. But we're so scared of that. So we've got to get much, much better at that interface. And it's a joy and a pleasure, right, to really understand that and become skillful at it. So I think it's the final frontier, the relationship and working out as we come back into the office and we start to encounter each other. If we can fall back in love with each other again, it becomes a fascinating journey, right? If we're scared and we try to assert ourselves in this complex, uncertain future, then we'll become the person that other people avoid. So D&I, really, really important, not for gender quotas and all that nonsense. D&I is really important because if we can unlock the power of the diverse crowd, we become wiser and we make better decisions, which are good for us, our team, our organization, and humanity. That's why it's the final frontier in my view.
Thanks, Alan. I'm just looking at the time here, and I just want to thank everybody for coming. I just wanted to drop a couple of URLs into the chat, Jack, if you can do that. So one of the ways that Alan was talking about the values profiles. We actually have a certification program for corporates and also for individual coaches. which we do. It's just 1 hour every for 5 weeks, 1 hour a week. If people are interested in finding out a little bit more about how they can assess where they are on that spiral in terms of their own value system, and also being able to articulate that to other individuals and to teams as well. It's fascinating when you do this to teams, and of course you can do this successfully all over the world. We've done this with teams in Australia and in New Zealand recently. So please do get in touch and follow those links. We'll also be sending out a recording of this and a PDF of the slides, so you can have a look at those slides as well. Bacteria in a human coat. I'll leave you with that that thought there, that comforting thought to take you into your evening, hopefully. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do, we'll have another one in about 2 months' time. Please do share the link with anybody that you think might be interested, and any feedback, please get back to me and tell me what you enjoy and tell me what you don't enjoy. It's always good, as Alan says, to have different opinions. So thanks very much and have a great evening.